and usually half of the answers have to do with the breaking of a law. But what we're finding here in our discussion today is that broken relationships are as fundamental to that, if not even more fundamental. And that's really that's the area that restorative justice is revolving around. Crime sets negative things in motion. You've already heard examples of where there's disconnection, distrust, disorientation to victims, disharmony in those webs of relationships. And a good justice process is essentially going to set positives in motion to counteract all of those negatives. Restoring connections, trust, orientation, harmony. Because if we're looking at the big picture, we want offenders back in the community at the point where they're actually not depleting resources, but giving as contributors. It's going to take that kind of restoration. What we don't want is a justice process that's advancing some of these very alienation points. We want to see positive things happen in a balanced way for victims, offenders, and community. Each one of them needs to have a way to go forward. For victims, there needs to be that combination of practical outcome as well as an interior experience of emotional support, security. However they define it is really important for them to do that. Offenders are needing that balance between support and accountability. And a little bit later I'm going to show why those two are not in an inverse relation, but really need to happen hand in hand. The community needs to be engaged, but also needs to experience a rebuilding of trust too, because if you look at how crime affects not just the incident, but all of those wider circles, if you think of a stone in a pond and there's ripples going out, the community is part of those circles. I'm going to cover 5 assumptions that have already been named by Howard and Rupert, but the connectivity defines community life. There's a web of relationships, and that goes into thinking about causes of crime. What we're finding in our county is that every offender who is wounding through crime has some kind of story of being wounded, and that takes one back into their own past to find out how have they been wounded, and how is their woundedness affected to their wounding patterns. Addressing harms is central for healing. This really is the center point that restorative justice processes zero around. Open communication empowers parties. Greg talked about how if there's not an early support to be able to show remorse or to apologize, you're not really empowering them to take that responsibility at the front end. And we find that when offenders are given those supports, they're more likely to own up to things, especially if they're in group work and hearing other offenders talk honestly about their patterns. But this happens for victims too. They're going to open up when they're supported and empowered. Internalization leads to responsibility. If there's not that internal reflection of how an offender can take ownership or be aware of how their actions have affected others, and there's an aha moment at some level, there's not going to be that ability to respond to the content of what they have done. And supports heighten accountability. We find that when there's greater supports at the front end, when you treat offenders with dignity and help them know that you're going to go forward now, but you have some obligations, that they're more apt to say, I am willing to be held accountable to whatever it takes to make it right. I find a lot of times that when these issues get politicized or debated, it falls into these two areas. You're either hard on crime or you're soft on crime. And principals and schools can use this language. I got to be harder. But you can find it all the way into the prison world and politicians debating funding. And so essentially, hard or soft has to do with an inverse relationship between accountability and support. What I think restorative justice, and it's not that restorative justice has a corner on the market, there's other ways of looking at justice that can be smart on crime. But smart on crime is essentially seeing how accountability and support both go up together and mutually support each other so they're both rising and maximizing each other. What I think our nation is finding now, both at federal levels and state levels and county levels, is that this is actually cost effective. And there's a lot of new research showing that the hard on crime strategies of the last couple decades are actually more cost intensive, and there's less positive offender change out of that. These are some encounter programs that have been typical over the last 30 years. Victim-offender dialogue and mediation is primarily what CMS has been doing in this area. But group conferencing broadens that circle and gets other support people in. Community boards and panels is just another model of bringing in the community voice to meet with offenders. Circle processes can take a variety of shapes, and there's many different kinds of circles. But all of these are encounters that are bringing the right people together to really fully have those discussions and have that depth work to bring about those internal changes. But as Howard said, these are encounters that aren't the only thing on what we would call the restorative justice map. There are three realms of restorative work, and restorative responses can happen at the front end. It might be a school teacher that has 1 minute with a disruptive student that is asking the kinds of questions that get that student to reflect enough to take stock of their own choices. That's what I call a restorative response. But it's also what communities do with victims. Spending time with victims or offenders at the front end of cases starts restorative work to help empower and to guide people. Without restorative encounters, you really do not have what I think all of us would call restorative justice programming, but it needs to be in conjunction with that front-end response stuff and some good restorative integrations at the back end, whether that's working with ways to help people become more responsible, whether it's treatment work that was talked about earlier. There's a lot of things that can help people just go forward. And I think the one thing I'd like to leave with you here is that the most important goal in restorative justice is not just bringing people together, but helping everyone involved to move forward in life. There are times where, because people are at different preparation stages or it's inappropriate to bring them together, don't think that that's the only goal that restorative justice has. It's looking at each offender, each victim, and saying what do they need in a tailored way that helps them go forward to be productive. These are what I call the three building blocks: ownership, empathy, and reparation. And all the models, all the responses, all the integrations at some level have to be aware of how these three work together. In a traditional context, we think of how guilt needs to be established, and then some sort of fair punishment is matched to that. If it goes into a restorative paradigm, we go from ownership to reparation. And in our society, we're all sort of wired. Once we've identified the problem, we want to fix that problem. I do that with my family all the time, and I just want to jump to a good end. Well, have you tried this? Have you tried that? And we often think that way with offenders. What I want to suggest is that restorative justice takes the long route to the same end. And the reason it wants to take that long route is because through empathy, where there's learning, there's discussion, there's awareness of how harms have affected other people, that's where the learning and the internalization is really happening. And what we're finding is that when you take that longer route through whatever program you have or whatever opportunity, you are maximizing your outcomes in terms of responsibility. Again, there's a response to the content of knowing what you've done, knowing better about who you are, and then having a sense of what you need to do in the future. So I translate these three into self-awareness that offenders need at some point as a starting point, because often they're just thinking of protecting themselves or wanting not to be caught. So self-awareness of what they did, moving to other awareness of how their actions have affected victims and community, to future awareness, which is essential if they're going to take positive responsibility. All of this involves some cognitive work and communication work. You can also see this progressing from past, present, and future. And if people are not going to be stuck in the past, either as victims or as offenders, that empathy learning piece is critical. We're talking a lot here about the offender's journey, but victims of crime are central stage to any restorative process. This perspective necessitates that victims become equal clients to any justice system and aims to provide full supports to meet the needs of victims as they define them. Some of you may have heard of the parallel justice movement, which is basically a way to provide stronger positive supports to victims, because the traditional system has sidelined them in so many different ways. Victims need to have choices, they need to have a voice, losses restored, trust restored. All of this, I think, is where the community has a lot of resources. If the government system right now has limited resources, this is really a place where the community can start to step in. So I want to end with a notion of partnership. In partnership with government agencies, the community can offer much to justice and peacemaking processes that government agencies are not able to do. Community-based programs can mobilize volunteerism. They can be flexible to tailor programs much faster, and they have the people power to do where government agencies just do not have the people power. But that partnership is important because government agencies give quality control, they ensure safety. There's a structural dimension to those agencies that can't be lost. So what we are really looking at is how can those partnerships grow in this county? How can more people power be mobilized if there's truly a crisis around funding issues? This is the program that I lead. If you want to jot down that website, you can see 8 different programs that we have where we're working in partnership with schools, police, courts, social services, and corrections. We're basically across the map. And one of the reasons we're fortunate in our county is we had a circuit court judge start our program, and it really laid a foundation for that partnership. But one of the things that Judge Bruner saw right from the beginning is he said governments cannot do it all well. They have to partner with community programs if there's going to be a holistic peacemaking dimension, if it's going to involve that relationship healing dimension. The community has to play a role in partnership. And that's where I think we're heading with a lot of our discussion. What does that look like more and better in Lane County? Thank you.